Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Today's founder is George Taylor, the indentured servant who signed the Declaration of Independence. George Taylor was originally born in Ireland, and at about 20 years old, he traded his labor for several years in exchange for the cost of traveling across the Atlantic. He ends up working for a man named Samuel Savage, who owned an ironworks in Pennsylvania. Taylor becomes really good at this particular career, and in fact, pretty quickly is responsible for taking charge of the books of the operation. Now, unfortunately for Samuel Savage, he passes away. George Taylor, however, ends up marrying his wife, Anne. This was not entirely uncommon at the time when someone you worked for passed away. It was a good way to get ahead. Now, they operated the business together for several years until their Samuel Savage's son is old enough to take over. At this point, George Taylor rents an ironworks from another man, William Allen, who Allentown, Pennsylvania is named after, and William Allen actually built what became Independence Hall before himself becoming a loyalist and not hanging out with the Patriots. That being said, George Taylor did side with the Patriots, and in fact, as such, was elected throughout most of the 1760s to the Colonial Assembly, despite being a lowly artisan. Now, he ends up moving on and renting from another person, Joseph Galloway, a different ironworks. Joseph Galloway ends up going to the First Continental Congress, and while there proposes the Galloway Plan of Union, which was an effort to find a middle ground between the colonists and Parliament. This didn't work, and once the Second Continental Congress comes around, well, a war breaks out, and Joseph Galloway runs away as a loyalist himself and leaves for London, never to return. In this situation, the Continental Congress came calling, as they want to do. As with most loyalists, they tried to seize the property, and they realized George Taylor's there and realized George Taylor's on their team. So he says, you know what, George? Or he says, the Continental Congress says, you know what, George? Why don't you keep doing what you're doing? And George says, great, because what I'm doing is making cannonballs. And he makes a bunch of cannonballs, about 260 cannonballs between 18 and 24 pounds that he delivers to the Continental Army. And the indication is that this is the first fulfilled shipment ordered by the Continental Army for any munitions. George Taylor paying for the cannonballs. Now, Taylor comes around and is eventually, I should say, once independence is voted for in early July of 1776, the Declaration isn't signed right away. First things first, they had to get rid of a bunch of people. Several states had people who did not support independence, and they were all quickly replaced once independence was declared. One of the replacements for the men leaving in Pennsylvania was George Taylor, chosen by his community to go sit in the Second Continental Congress. And he arrives in early August, just in time to be there for the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So though he had done basically no political legwork for independence, he gets his name right there on the document. He hangs out for about 6 months before he is removed from his position, but very shortly thereafter, he is elected to Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council. After independence was declared, Pennsylvania had a strange government for a while there, which didn't have a governor. It had an executive council of several people who were the executive branch. And George Taylor spent a little bit of time as one of those people. Unfortunately for Taylor, he falls ill not long after this. He has to go back home and try and take care of some of his finances. He had kind of ruined them while he was supporting the war effort early on. And I didn't mention he was briefly a colonel in the militia, but he doesn't seem to have seen service in that position. He falls ill, and then unfortunately he dies in 1781, just a few months before the victory at Yorktown. It's kind of a tragic ending to a really interesting character. We talk a lot about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Ben Franklin is a real Horatio Alger story, right? Well, George Taylor literally sold himself into hard labor just to come to North America and ends up signing a nation's founding document. So that is the story of George Taylor. I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, if you did, do me a favor and hit like. It's great for the channel and it helps people learn about the American Revolution with us. If you're new here, subscribe. I put out videos about the founders 7 days a week, and I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.